Hi everyone. Today we're going to learn the quadratic formula, and this is a really important lesson. This is one you guys are going to use a lot, not just this year, but for as long as you're taking math. So next year when you guys take integrated math 3, you'll use this formula. If you take pre-calculus or calculus, no matter how far you go in math, this is a formula that you're going to keep using over and over and over. So it's an important one, and you definitely want to really learn this lesson and know the formula and understand how to use it. Now, what we're talking about right now in the middle of our lesson is we're talking about solving quadratics. And what we just learned was how to solve them by factoring. What the quadratic formula is another way to solve them. So the quadratic formula is a formula, obviously, from the name. And it's going to give you the solutions or answers to any quadratic equation that's in standard form. So here's the quadratic formula. First of all, this is what I mean by standard form. When I say in standard form, I'm talking about this thing right here. You have ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So the important things about standard form are, number one, equals 0. Same as when we were solving by factoring. In order to solve a quadratic, whether you're factoring or using the quadratic formula, it has to be equal to 0. Now, number two, to be in standard form, what you want to do is line up the x's in order. X squared comes first, x comes second, the constant term, or the number part with no x, comes third. Now, the letters A, B, and C stand for the letters in the problems, and they can be either positive or negative numbers. So if it starts with 2x squared, A is 2. If it says plus 5x, B is 5. If it says minus 10 on the end, then C is negative 10 because it's negative, so it's minus instead of plus. So basically the A, the B, and the C are just the numbers, the coefficients from the problem in standard form. Now here's the quadratic formula. You have x equals, now the equation says negative b. A good way to think about this, usually when you learn the quadratic formula, instead of negative b, you say the opposite of b. Because what happens is, when you have negative b, we don't know what b is. If b is a positive number, then yeah, it's negative b. But if b is a negative number, it's negative whatever, and that double negative turns into a positive. So again, usually instead of negative b, we say the opposite of b, meaning if b is a positive number, make it negative, and if b is a negative number, make it positive. So what you have is the opposite of b, plus or minus, and we'll talk about that in a second too. Then you have this big square root. You have the square root of b squared minus 4ac, and we'll talk more about square roots in the next lesson. For now, I'm going to have you kind of just focus on, you can use a calculator to evaluate it. And then the whole thing is one big fraction, and it's all over 2a. Now what you notice in that formula, the variables are the letters a, b, and c. That's from up here in the problem. So like right here, this b comes from right here. This a down here comes from right here. This b is the same one. It comes from the middle one again. And then this a here comes from here, and this c here comes from here. So basically the a, the b, and the c from standard form are what you plug into the quadratic formula in order to get your answer. All right, now it is a big messy formula. You have to be careful with it. So here's some steps that'll help you guys use it. Step 1, make sure the equation is in standard form. And I put in parentheses, make sure it's equal to 0, just like when we were solving by factoring. If you want to solve a quadratic, before you think about, do I want to factor, do I want to use quadratic formula, how am I going to answer that, before you do any of that, always make it equal to 0. Step 2, pick out a, b, and c from the equation. If it's in standard form, it's going to be very simple. They're just the numbers right there for you. Just pull them out of the problem. Number 3, this is what I was talking about on the last slide, substitute them into the quadratic formula. So start with the quadratic formula, put a where it goes, put b where it goes, put c where it goes. Then when you go to do the evaluating part, don't try to do it all in one step. That can be very confusing. So just do the square root part first. You have that one part of the equation that says the square root of b squared minus 4ac. Figure out what that equals. And I said, you're welcome to use a calculator for now. Just, type it into a calculator, do the square root, see what you get. Then, remember, the formula had that plus or minus in it, has a plus over a minus. That's a formula way of saying there are two answers. And remember, just like when you're solving by factoring, you usually get two answers. That plus or minus is why you get two answers from the quadratic formula. So what you want to do is separate it. You're going to make two separate answers, one of them using the plus and one of them using the minus. And then evaluate each one. Each one is going to be fairly simple. It's going to be something plus something divided by something else, and the same thing with a minus in the middle. So let's do an example. And for our first example today, I'm going to give you an equation. It's x squared minus 6x minus 16 equals 0. We're going to answer this one twice. We're going to solve it by factoring first, and then by the quadratic formula. And the reason I want you to do it twice, or the reason I want you to see it twice, is I want you to see that it works both ways. We get the right answer either way. So this is two separate ways of doing the same problem. And then as we move on through the next couple weeks, we'll talk about why we need two ways. Why sometimes one way is better, or sometimes only one way works, things like that. But right now, let's just try the two different methods. So I'm going to move over here, and I'm going to say I have x squared minus 6x minus 6. I'm just copying the problem right now. So let's do factoring first. If I'm going to solve this one by factoring, then what I'm looking for is two numbers that multiply to negative 16 and add to negative 6. So let me start with a factor tree over here for negative 16. It's a negative number, so it has to be negative times positive. So it could be positive 1 times negative 16, or negative 1 times positive 16. Now, as I'm mentally checking, neither of those adds up to negative 6. The first one is negative 15. The second one is positive 15. So then I try 2 times 8. Could be 2 times negative 8, or negative 2 times positive 8. And actually, this one right here is the one I want. So I'm going to stop my list. I could keep going, because 16 is also 4 times 4. But once you've found the one that works, you don't have to finish that list. We're just looking for the numbers that multiply to negative 16 and add to negative 6. And I found them. It's positive 2 and negative 8. All right, now we factored. We're equal to 0. Now we can separate and solve. This is the zero product property. If you have two numbers that are multiplied together and the answer is 0, then either the first one, x minus 2, or I'm sorry, x plus 2, is the 0, or the second one, x minus 8, is 0. And each one can be solved in one step. So the first one, I would subtract 2 from both sides. The plus 2 and the minus 2 cancel. The x drops down. 0 minus 2 is negative 2. That's my first answer. Now for the second one, I would add 8 to both sides. Minus 8 and plus 8 cancel. X drops down. 0 plus 8 is 8. Okay, nothing new there. That was exactly what we have been doing. That was solving by factoring. Now, let's try solving by the quadratic formula. This is what's going to be new for us today. And we should get the exact same answers. We should get negative 2 and 8 again. Let's see if that happens. So to use the quadratic formula, I said step 1, make sure it's in standard form. It is. It's equal to 0 and it goes in order. X squared, x, number part. Step 2, let's pick out a, b, and c. So when you have an x squared by itself, what that means is you have 1x squared, and it means a equals 1 for this problem. Then I have a negative 6x, so b is negative 6, the number in front of the x. And I have a minus 16, so c is negative 16. So I'm just picking numbers out. Positive 1 for x squared, negative 6 for x, negative 16 for the constant or the number part with no x on it. Now, I'm going to start by just writing down the quadratic formula. You have x equals negative b, or the opposite of b, plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And now let's put the numbers in. So the opposite of b, now remember b was -6, so I'm going to start with a +6. That's what that means, the opposite of b. Whatever sign b has, change the sign. So since in my problem b is -6, this question is going to start with a +6. Then I have the plus or minus, and I have the square root of b squared. Now this one, technically you don't change the sign on this one, because remember the first b is the opposite of b. This is a regular b. It actually doesn't matter because we're going to square it, and when you square it, everything turns positive anyways. So I'm going to put the -6. If you put a +6 there, it actually doesn't even matter. But then we have -4 times a, which is 1, and times c, which is -16. And it's all over 2 times a, and a is 1. So see how I haven't done any work yet. I haven't done any multiplying or dividing or square rooting. All I did is I took the quadratic formula and I put the numbers in the right place. I put -6 in for b. I put 1 in for a. I put -16 in for c. Now we get to the work part. And I said, what I like to do for this, let's just do the square root part separately. Well, I'll do the bottom two. 2 times 1 is 2. That's so easy you can do it in your head. So I'll do that too. But I'm going to do the square root part. Now remember, I said you can use a calculator on this. I don't need you to do this in your head right now. So if you grab a calculator and type all that in, and let the calculator do the work for you and take the square root, it actually comes out to 10. Because you have -36, -6 squared is 36. And then you have the -4 times the -16, that turns into +64. Add it all together, you get 100. And the square root of 100 is 10. But remember, I said you don't need to do that work even on paper or in your head. Use a calculator for that. It's perfectly fine. Now, here's where we're going to get 2 separate answers. So we have 6 plus or minus 10 over 2. This is where I said separate them. So for your first answer, I'm going to use the plus. That would be 6 plus 10 over 2. For the second answer, I would use the minus. That would be 6 minus 10 over 2. That's what the plus or minus means. It's a compact notation way of saying you're getting 2 answers. They're exactly the same, but one of them has a plus and one of them has a minus. So if we start doing the work here, the first one, 6 plus 10 is 16, and 16 divided by 2 is 8. That's the answer we got on the first one. So I get x equals 8 here. Now on the second one, 6 minus 10 is -4, and -4 divided by 2 is -2. We got the same answer twice. So you can see solving works both ways. You can solve by factoring, you can solve using the quadratic formula, and you're going to get the right answer either way as long as you do the work right. Now remember, the reason we're learning 2 ways, and we'll talk a lot more about this over the next week or two, there are some times when like only the quadratic formula works. Or factoring maybe works, but it would be really hard. So I'm going to use, there's definitely times when you want to do both. So you can't just say, oh, quadratic's formula is hard, I'm never going to do that, I'm just going to factor every time. Because factoring doesn't work every time. You got to know both methods. All right. So let me give you one example of why the quadratic formula would be good. When we were solving by factoring, we said you can't factor when there's a number in front of the x squared. If you have a 2x squared or a 5x squared, you can factor, but I haven't taught you how yet. It's actually much harder. We'll look at it later in the year, but we only saw the ones where we had an x squared all by itself, not a 2x squared or a 7x squared. One of the good things about quadratic formula is you can solve those questions now, even though we haven't learned how by factoring yet. So this is what I meant. I said those equations, they are sometimes factorable, but it's much harder, and I haven't taught you that yet. So we'll hold off on that. So let's look at one last example for today. So for this example, we're going to solve for x again. The difference is we have the number in front of the x squared. We have the 2 there. Now, we've seen questions that have a number there, but the ones we've seen, you've been able to factor out. And we can't factor out that 2 this time because the other numbers, the 7 and the 15, don't divide by 2. So it's not a common term to factor out. So this is a question I haven't even shown you yet because we don't know how to solve it. I didn't show you how to factor these yet. And I'm not going to yet because we're going to use the quadratic formula to solve that. So let's go ahead and do that. If I want to use quadratic formula, the first thing I do, I go standard form, equal to 0, in order, x squared part first, x part second, number part third, and then I pick out a, b, and c. So a is the number in front of x squared, that would be 2. B is the number in front of x, that would be negative 7. And c is the constant or number part with no x, and that's negative 15. And I'm going to plug those numbers into the quadratic formula. Let me start just like I did the last one by just copying it down. So we have x equals the opposite of b, plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac, and it's all over 2a. And let's start putting numbers in. So we have the opposite of b. B was negative 7, so I'm going to start with a positive 7. Then we have our plus or minus, and then we have our big square root. Now inside the square root, the first thing is b squared, and b was negative 7, so I'm going to start with negative 7 squared. Then you have minus 4 times a, and a is 2, and also times c, which is negative 15. And then that whole thing is over 2 times a, and a, again, is 2. So that was step 2, is just putting the numbers in. Now for the next step, I said, let's leave the 7. We'll do the bottom, because that's super easy. 2 times 2 is 4. And then the square root part. I said, let's just do the square root part first. And I said, you don't have to do it by hand. You're welcome to grab a calculator and type it in. If you do that, if you type the whole thing in, you do negative 7 squared minus 4 times 2 times negative 15, you get your answer, you square root that. What it actually comes out to for this question is 13. So then you say, okay, well, it looks just like the last question we did. Let's split it up. Let's do the plus and minus separately. So I could have 7 plus 13 over 4, or I could have 7 minus 13 over 4. Now the first one works out really nicely. 7 plus 13 is 20, and 20 divided by 4 is 5. So your first answer is 5. Now the second one doesn't work out quite that nicely. When you do 7 minus 13, you get negative 6. And see, negative 6 doesn't divide by 4. And I want you to look for that. That's going to happen. One rule, whenever you have this number here in front of x squared and you're solving, what that actually means is at least one of your answers is going to be a fraction. Maybe both, but at least one. So in this case, one of our answers wasn't. One of our answers was a whole number, 5. But negative 6 over 4, that's a fraction. And we're going to leave it as a fraction. We are going to reduce it because I can divide both of those numbers by 2. And what you would have, 6 divided by 2 is 3, 4 divided by 2 is 2, and your second answer is negative 3 over 2. So we got 2 answers again. We used quadratic formula again. It worked exactly like our first example. The difference is, just remember, anytime you have a number in front of x squared, that means at least one of your answers is going to be a fraction.